I've got a question for the adults. I got a question for the kids. The kids, and it's pretty similar, but okay, adults, here's that question for you. Do you remember the first place you lived outside of what you would have called your home? Maybe you went into the military and you lived in the barracks for the first time outside of your home. Maybe you went to college and you lived in a dorm room. Maybe you moved to somebody else and you rented somebody else's room somewhere else. Where was that first place that you lived outside of your home? And do you remember what it felt like? Kids, you haven't had this experience yet, but I want you to think for yourself. What would it be like to live outside of your home? Where do you imagine that being? And as you're doing that, I want you to think about what it was like to be outside of the constraints of, say, your parents' home, or whatever your home life was, and to be out there for the first time on your own. And kids, I want you to think about for yourself, what will it be like for you to be out there for the first time on your own? Yes, you might have to buy your own food. You might even have to cook your own food. But what do you think that will be like? Well, I remember for myself, first time for me, had my '88 Ford Taurus, and I was moving in as a freshman at the University of Delaware. And I had this trunk. It was an old trunk, but it was like this cool, like old trunk, like stickers on it and stuff. And I had all of my stuff in it. And for the next 4 years, that trunk would go with me to 10 different places that I would call my home. For a couple summers, it was out in a tent. For a few semesters, it was at a school, and sometimes it was here, sometimes it was there. But that trunk was where I would call myself home. My home was where that trunk was. And when I was out there on my own, though, I remember this. I remember my freshman year very clearly. I remember thinking to myself, I don't know why I would do the right thing. Like deep down, I knew that there was like a right and wrong out there. I didn't necessarily know what the right and wrong was, but I knew that there was a right, and I could look around in the lives around me, and they were probably doing the wrong thing. But I remember thinking to myself, I don't know, I don't have a reason to do the right thing. Now, this was sort of in the middle of my spiritual journey. I believe that this is a question that God cultivated in my heart in order to start stirring my interest in Him. But I remember looking at the binging lifestyle around me and thinking to myself, I don't think that's what I should be doing. But I don't have, now that my parents aren't here, I don't know why I would do the right thing. Uh, I'm putting this out there, and I want you to think about what it was like for you to be out on your own, because we're in the middle of a series, and I always have a reason for these questions. We're in a series called Hope for Our City. Hope for our community. What does it look like to have hope for the place we live, for the people we live among, the community that we participate in? What does it mean to have hope for that? And we've been looking at the book of Acts, and we've been seeing the stories of the ordinary men and women who had seen the risen Jesus, who had trusted him and had believed in him, and had gotten sent out throughout the entire Roman world, and were changing the world by their simple faith and proclamation that they had seen this man who had claimed to be God, and now he's risen from the dead. And that proclamation brought hope, and transforming hope that began there and has continued to change the world generation to generation, culture to culture. And today in particular, as we think about hope for the city, I'm going to focus on a particular aspect of the city and the particular aspect of our life. And we might even want to call this hope for the university. I know it's not the university, but just bear with me. Hope for the university. Why? Because we're following the Apostle Paul, and the Apostle Paul is left all by himself in a city and known as Athens. We know the ruins to this day. It's a famous city. It was the center of Greek philosophical culture. And as they'll describe this city, all they love to do is sit around and talk about the different ideas. And Paul didn't have any allies. He was completely on his own. He didn't have anybody with him. And pretty much everybody in that city would disagree with him. Have you ever been in a situation like that? When you think about that first time out on your own, were you on your own with your beliefs? Well, Paul knew what that was like. And what we're going to see him do is we're going to see how he interacts in the intellectual center of the Roman world. And my hope is, as we look at this and we study this, we are going to come away with this with just so much confidence in the foundational message of the gospel and who Jesus is to be a foundation for the way we build our thinking and our world view. All right, so let me do this. Let me go ahead and read this passage, and we're going to see what Paul does when he's dropped in all by himself amongst an entire city of people who disagree with him, and see how he responds to that challenge and hear the message he delivers. All right, so we are in Acts 17. I'm going to pick it up in verse 16. While Paul was waiting for them in Athens, he was by himself. Luke had stayed behind in Philippi, and a few others were in another city. He had gone off ahead to Athens. He says, while Paul was by himself waiting for them in Athens, he was greatly distressed to see that the city was full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogue with both Jews and God-fearing Greeks, as well as in the marketplace day by day with those who happened to be there. A group of Epicurean and Stoic philosophers began to debate with him. Some of them asked, "What is this babbler trying to say?" Others remarked, "He seemed to be advocating foreign gods." They said this because Paul is preaching the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. Then they took him and brought him to a meeting of the Areopagus, where they said to him, "May we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting? You are bringing some strange ideas to our ears, and we would like to know what they mean." All the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there spent their time doing nothing but talking about and listening to the latest ideas. It's like their Twitter or something. It's like the Twitter of that area. Anyway, Paul then stood up in the meeting of the Areopagus and said, "People of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious. For as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription: to an unknown God. So you are ignorant of the very thing you worship, and this is what I'm going to proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth, and does not live in temples built by human hands. And he is not served by human hands as if he needed anything. Rather, he himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else. From one man he made all the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth, and he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. God did this so they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from any one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. As some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring. Therefore, since we are God's offspring, we should not think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image made by human design and skill. In the past, God overlooked such ignorance, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent. For he has set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed. He has given proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead. When they heard about the resurrection of the dead, some of them sneered, but others said, "We want to hear you again on this subject." At that, Paul left the council. Some of the people became followers of Paul and believed. Among them was Dionysius, a member of the Areopagus, also a woman named Damaris, and a number of others. All right, so Paul gets himself into a little bit of a mess. He gets himself into this place called the Areopagus, which was this sort of like this moral, ethical sort of governing board that took the ideas of this day and communicated to the community how things are supposed to be, what it meant. So this was a kind of a big deal, but his message had been so compelling, and this message about the resurrection had gotten their attention, so that it made them want to listen. There's so much in this passage I'd love to talk about. We are going to talk about mostly the front end of this. And where I want to start out with this is with the message of the gospel. Remember, gospel means good news. The good news that something happened, the good news that has come, the Messiah has come, and the evidence is that he's risen from the dead, and everyone's seen it. So the message of the gospel can serve as the foundation of a worldview that you can build upon. All right. In fact, it's intended to be the foundation of our intellectual worldview. While they're there, the Athenians said, "Look, we want to know what this new teaching that you are presenting." He's presenting something very different. And in our world, it's going to be increasingly different. Increasingly, people are going to have people have a much less of a biblical worldview. They're going to have more and more ideas that disagree with ours. So having clarity on our ideas is going to be really, really important. But what you'll see from the summary of Paul's preaching is his message about the resurrection. All right, and that's the foundation for everything that we think and everything that we believe. On Christ the solid rock I stand. Like the hymn says, all other ground is sinking sand. So I want to show you something. And you might think it's kind of weird, but you're going to need to understand a little bit of something about me. So I did not grow up in the faith. I did not grow up in the church. And so when I sensed a call to ministry, I thought God was calling myself and Kathleen. I thought God was calling us to go serve as missionaries overseas. And so when we got married, we figured it was time to go get me some training. And Kathleen worked really hard, and I was able to go through seminary. But the understanding of our time in seminary is that I was preparing myself to train pastors in the Muslim world to have a strong theology and to pastor the church. So in my mind, I prepared or went through seminary to be a missionary, a missionary in another culture. I was learning Hebrew and Greek so I can understand it in English, so I can translate it to people who understand it in Turkish, so they can communicate it in a way that's meaningful. So I had a whole bunch of things. So sometimes when I talk, I might sound like a missionary egghead, all right? But I'm going to give you something missionary eggheadish today that I think will really help you in your faith, and particularly help you help all of us as we begin to connect with people in a culture that has an sort of increasingly or decreasing understanding of a biblical worldview. All right, so I want to introduce you a diagram. I'm going to show you this diagram. This is an anthropologist, a guy named Lloyd Quast wrote this. And what I want you to see here is, as you're looking at this thing, see it as an onion of culture. Anytime you experience another culture or something different than what you're used to, what you will see is the behaviors on the outside. And that's the green coating around the outside. The behaviors is what is done. And a lot of times we go and we see people from another culture and they're acting differently, and like, why are they doing that? That doesn't make sense at all. And but what we need to understand, every culture has its own internal logic. We just don't understand it. And so what Quast says is that every culture has multiple layers, okay? On the outside is the behaviors of that particular community. Just below the behavioral level, there's the values that inherit in that community. The values of a community, the values of a culture, determine what is good, what is better, and what is best. All right? And below the values layer and shaping the values layer are the beliefs of that culture. right? That's what where people discern for themselves what is true. All right. The beliefs of a community or culture will determine this is true, this isn't true. Okay. And even below the belief, there's something known as that worldview. The worldview is that deep sense in the heart as to what is real. And what shapes our understanding of what's real will shape our understanding of our beliefs, will shape our understanding of our values, will shape the way we function when it comes to our behaviors. Let me see if I can give you a couple examples of this. Let me give, for example, when you go into the center of any sort of like town in America, think of an old school town that's got a town center. What do you find in the center of every town? All right, I'll give you that. You feel free to talk to your phone or talk to your TV. You can suggest something, right? What do you find? You find a church. You find a bank. What else do you find? Some towns you have a courthouse, right? If it's a county seat like Westchester, but you almost always find a war statue, right? And if you would, if you look at the behaviors or even the external layer to the behaviors, you see the relics. When you see what's reflected in the community, you'll see that in America, there's certain things that are deep and true to like the classic American culture. We believe in God, and God we trust is on our money, right? And so historically, we have a deep belief in God, and we have a deep commitment to our economy and a deep commitment to our military. And it shows up in just about every town. You make sure that there's plenty of churches at the center, and there's a bank, and then there's a military statue, right? That's just about everywhere you go, right? Now go to Australia. Okay? If you go to the center of a town, an old school town in Australia, what are you going to find there? You're not going to find a church at the center of the town. What do you think you might find at the center of a town in Australia? You'll find a prison. Why? Well, Australia was founded as a prisoner colony for the United Kingdom, right? And so Great Britain and their other colonies would send their criminals to Australia, right? And so if you're a community of criminals, what are you going to do? What's going to be real to you, and how will that shape your beliefs, your values, your practices? Where you're going to put a jail at the center. And what's typical speaking is the church is on the outside of town, the jail is at the center. Here in America, we have the church at the center and the jail's on the outside of town. The prison's on the outside of town. Why? Well, these things are reflective of a deeper worldview. Another example. Okay, you go. Maybe you've been watching some of the footage of life in Afghanistan, and you could even think about footage you might have seen about life in other parts of the Muslim world. How do people dress? In the Muslim world, rarely will you see people dress in order to stand out or get attention. In the Muslim world, people dress very standard, very plain, very uniform, right? Well, let's take that thing back. They have certain values. They're shaped by their beliefs, their Muslim beliefs. And deep down in the Muslim beliefs, God is one. And then there's one prophet, Muhammad, right? And Muhammad lived in the 7th century, 7th and 8th century. And so almost everything you find in the Muslim world reflects the cultures of the 7th and 8th century. In particular, you sense the unity that's reflected by there's one God and his prophet Muhammad, right? And so if you're a good Muslim, you are uniform to the one God and the one God and that on the one prophet Muhammad, and that reflects itself in every aspect of culture. Now take America and the Western world. And I would suggest that the deep parts of our worldview is a God that's 3 in 1, that's diverse, right? And so we believe in diverse expressions. And you look where Christianity goes, wherever Christianity goes, the value of diversity increases. Why? Because our God 3 in 1 has a sense of diversity, right? The university came out of a vision of a one idea one school or one community bring a diverse set of colleges together to have a common vision, right? And so you play these things out. All right, a third example, go to different corporate cultures, right? When you go to Google headquarters, right? And they've got ping pong tables there that reflect something of their culture. If you go to Apple headquarters, that reflects some of their culture. Go to an Amazon distribution center. What does what they do and the way they lay out things reveal about what they value and what they believe and what's most real to them? All right. Let me ask you the question. If an alien from another planet or an alien from another country, or maybe just like a child, like an alien from your own home, would watch your life and they just watched your behaviors, they just watched your behaviors and wrote them down, just took notes, entirely objective, what would they conclude about your values? What would they conclude about your beliefs? What would they conclude about your worldview? The Christian life, discipleship, you might say, is the bringing together our lives around the truth that Jesus is Lord and His grace is sufficient. When that is deeply understood to be real at the worldview level, an understanding of what is true about God's creation, about His great love, about humanity. When those things are true at the worldview level and understood in a belief sense and shaped when it comes to our values, it plays itself out in our behaviors. And what happens is that there becomes integrity between what we believe, what is real, what we value, and how we behave. That's the heart of Christian spirituality. That's the heart of what it means to be a church together, to come together, to bring this kind of integrity into our lives. That's what it means to grow in our faith, to have a growing consistency between our worldview, our beliefs, our values, and our behaviors. All right? So our first point is that when you can believe and trust that Jesus is Lord, His grace is sufficient, that is a bedrock understanding that you can build all other truths around. Because point number 2 goes this way. If it is true that Jesus is Lord, His grace is sufficient, that God is the creator of all things, just as Paul declares, right? If these things are true, that means every other worldview not based upon the revelation of God will ultimately be flawed and will betray those who adopt it. Those worldviews and the beliefs and the values that come from it and the behaviors that come out of that will fail those who trust in that. See, Paul had this situation. He was in Athens, and as he was talking, he had these different groups of people who were challenging him. They're the Epicureans and the Stoics and the philosophers, right? And they had all kinds of different ideas, and their ideas were sort of at the center of their worldview, right? That their particular idea occupied the center and shaped their beliefs, values, and behaviors. For example, the Epicureans genuinely believed that the meaning of life is all wrapped around one's personal pleasure. And that the meaning of life is about seeking pleasure. And if you would watch, if an alien would watch the Epicureans, you would see that worldview shape their beliefs, shape their values, and shape their behaviors as they continued to look for pleasure. The Stoics were, in some ways, the opposite of the Epicureans. At the center of the worldview of the Stoics, they believed that life was about suffering, right? And so one thing to note about the Epicureans, right? The Stoics, they had an enormous amount of resilience. Why? Because they believed that not only was life suffering, but we needed to learn. They believed they needed to endure, and so they valued resistance. They valued discipline. They valued patience and long suffering. And there's there's certainly good and true things about the Stoic worldview, and there's certainly good and true things about the Epicurean worldview. But if those things are at the center, eventually they will fail each of them. And you might, in your life, you can think of people who, yeah, that guy's relatively Epicurean, or and this guy's relatively Stoic. And you can see some of those values, those Greek values, play themselves out in our own day and age, right? Well, Paul was with the Epicureans, he was with the Stoics, he's also the philosophers. The philosophers were the ones who, philos in Greek is love, Sophia, wisdom. They just loved wisdom. They loved ideas. They're trying to always figure things out. They had all these different ideas. And so here's how Paul challenged them. Here's how Paul challenged them. And I want you to hear this. And I want you to see if this can connect to you, or connect maybe to the environment you see. Maybe you see this play itself out in your friends, or in your school, in your workplace, or in your community. Could you say something like this to your friends? He says to them, I see that in every way you are religious. See, as Paul was walking around, he saw the different temples. And in each temple there would be an idol, the god of the sun, or to Zeus, or the different Greek gods, right? And they had all these different gods, but like they weren't sure if they had all of them, so they made sure they had one to the unknown God, because they wanted to make sure they covered all their bases. But what you see Paul doing is he's speaking to them at a worldview level, because they didn't have a biblical worldview to understand who the Messiah might be, or what a resurrection was be. So he's going to challenge them at the level of their worldview. And what I want to do is I want to take a moment. I want to help you have a sense as to how Paul thought about this. What Paul would say about you, and what Paul would say about me, and what he would say about every human, is that every single person, whether they believed in God or not, is fundamentally a worshiper. The real question is, what are we really worshiping? So Paul kind of like to kind of, I should say, pull back the curtains on Paul's thought there. I'm just going to read a little passage from the book of Romans, chapter 1. And hold on, because, well, this is pretty bold what he's going to say. He says, the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness. What I want you to hear there is the wrath of God. What he's not saying is that God's not throwing fireballs at people like the movies might portray. What he's saying is that people have suppressed the truth. And what we experience when people have suppressed the truth is the absence of God's truth, which reveals essentially everything that God promised would happen if you suppress the truth of him. We have children. Sometimes we have to give them consequences for their behaviors. Most of the time, though, the consequences for kids when they do the wrong thing is the natural consequences when you do the wrong thing. And the wrath of God here is pretty much the natural consequences of denying the truth about who he is. So he says, so he's speaking about people who suppress the truth by their wickedness, since what may be known about God is plain to them because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power, divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him. And their thinking became futile, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like mortal human beings and birds and animals and reptiles. Therefore, God gave them over in the sinful desires of their heart. And several places later it'll say, God will give them over. Instead of worshiping God for who he is, and when we have suppressed the truth about who he is, we find other things to worship. We will place our affections at the center of our worldview, something else besides God. All people are worshipers, and if we do not worship God, we will find something else, some kind of idol to commit ourselves to. And here's the thing, what you need to recognize, when you commit yourself to something to worship like that, it begins shaping your beliefs, begins shaping your values, begins shaping your behaviors. And then it begins shaping the way we live. In the Old Testament, the word for worship is often used serve. Like, what God will you serve? And this is a helpful call to us. As we think about our own worldview, who really is at the center? Who really is at the center of our worldview? And let me see if I can just give you a little simple example. And I'll pick on Wall Street because it's always easy to pick on, right? Wall Street will present itself as another thing to worship, right? If Jesus is our king, prophet, and priest, the king is who you obey, the prophet is who you listen to, and the priest is who blesses you. And Jesus is he's our king, we obey him. He's our prophet, we listen to his words. And if we trust him, we'll experience the blessing of following him. Well, when Wall Street sets itself up, and when people set Wall Street up in the place of Jesus, what happens is that people feel like they need to obey Wall Street, right? And so they'll listen to all the prophets that will make sure that the values and the reality of Wall Street, right? Shareholder value is everything, right? They'll listen to the prophets of Wall Street say, if you do this, you will have shareholder value, right? And if you obey the king, Wall Street as king, and if you listen to the prophets of Wall Street, you'll get the blessings of Wall Street, right? And if you make Wall Street your master, and listen to their prophets and look for their blessing, you too can enjoy the blessings of Wall Street if Wall Street's your God. Now, there's oftentimes a lot of downside because, as the Beatles say, money can't buy your love, right? But, well, that's just the price you pay if you're going to place Wall Street at the center of your world view. What ends up happening, though, for a lot of us is that we don't just simply exchange one for another. We have competing idols for our heart, for our attention, for our worldview. You may have heard the term cognitive dissonance, right? That's when two conflicting beliefs try to take over the center of the way we think. We can oftentimes have accurate beliefs, right? But they're undone by different behaviors or maybe a different worldview. And I have good news for you. Now that we are going to be in person pretty much every week, really soon, every single one of us is going to have the opportunity to either run late getting to church and speed and get mad at people before we worship Jesus on the way to church, right? Or even better, if you're a family, you can yell at each other and get mad at each other because of how important it is to get there on time to worship Jesus. Every single one of us can experience the cognitive dissonance of saying, Jesus is real, but I'm really mad at everybody else in my life. Everybody's going to be able to experience it. That's cognitive dissonance. I believe this, but this thing seems to control me. It's the heart of the Christian life to address that cognitive dissonance and continue to build a world that's built on the center of Jesus as Lord and Master, and his grace is sufficient. Information, podcasts, good reading material can help our intellect, but the problem goes deeper. One more thing on this. Along the way, we are going to have people who are going to disagree with us. They're going to think differently than us. They're going to have a different worldview that's going to have different beliefs, different values, and different behaviors. We don't have to argue with these people. And in fact, we don't have to fight these folks. But we can engage them in conversation, and we can learn to listen to them. We don't have to defend our faith. We can know our faith. Knowing our faith is really, really helpful. But I'm going to give you two questions, though. If you want to help people understand maybe their own pre-commitments, And maybe win some credibility for what you believe, ask two simple questions. The first one is this. Anytime somebody is challenging what you believe, ask them, how do you know about what they believe? And they may give you an answer, but then ask them again, how do you know that to be true? How do you know that to be true? Almost every single time, if you continue to ask the question, how do you know, you'll find somebody who has a faith commitment. An atheist at some point, it takes they have to make a faith leap themselves to believe there isn't a God. It's just as much of a leap of faith to say there is no God as it is there is a God. Everybody has circular reasoning, right? And so everybody's worldview begins with faith. So ask them, how do they know? Until they say, I just believe it to be true. Okay, well, let's talk about comparing different beliefs. Secondly, ask this question: can what they believe and what they're suggesting work for every culture and every generation? Most rival beliefs of the Christian faith is designed to fit a particular generation or a particular culture. The gospel is the only thing that can transcend cultures and generations and be transformative in every culture and generation without being damaging, but redeeming. And yes, every culture and generation will have its own disagreements with the gospel. That being said, the gospel isn't bound to any culture generation. And you'll be hard pressed to find anything that works like that for every culture generation. But if somebody's going to claim that something is true, it needs to be true for everybody. And if it can't be true for anybody, is it really true for anybody? Now, here's the thing. It's tempting to become proud about this, to protect ourselves from that. We continue to ask ourselves, does what I love reflect what I say is real, what I say I believe? And if that doesn't keep you humble, I challenge you to continue to take a look, continue to ask the question. The journey of the Christian life is continuing to sift the false worship out of our life, to continuing to focus ourselves on the integrity of the statement that Jesus is Lord, His grace is sufficient, and that can shape my beliefs, my values, and my behaviors. The third thing that we see in this passage is this. If this is true, this message must be preached. Preached and practiced. Preaching and practice requires a church. Paul said, what you worship as unknown, I proclaim to you. I'm going to preach to you. Paul's going to explain the gospel message. He's going to start with the sovereign God who is over all things, who created all things, who placed them in a specific place, and yet is near to them and will actually hold them accountable and hold you and me accountable for the way we use our lives. And Paul's goal right there isn't to win an argument. His goal, I think, falls right in line with our mission, is to help people find their way back to God. It's not an intellectual argument. It's not just a rational thing. Worship comes from the heart. This is not an argument of the mind. And when it comes to us at church, we're not trying to argue people to agree with us. We're not looking for people to agree with us. We're not looking to offer a better product. We don't want to be the best Sunday morning entertainment. We want to help people find their way back to a relationship with the one who loves them, to the Jesus who died for them. Which means that we need to deal with people's hearts and minds and real everyday lives. That's why Jesus said, I am going to build my church. His commitment, his plan A, and he has no plan B, is to build a church. He didn't say, I'm going to send out an army of teachers. He didn't say, I'm going to go build a lot of hospitals, though the church has. He didn't say, I am going to build the contemporary Christian music industry. Music's a great, important part of things, right? He didn't say, I'm going to give everybody a really great parenting curriculum. If the parents could just get things right, then we'll be fine. He didn't say, I'm going to build a lot of Christian schools. He didn't even say, I'm going to build out Christian mingles so singles can find the right people to marry. He didn't say these things. He said, I'm going to build a church, and the church is going to carry this message, and people are going to learn to belong in a community of this message. People are going to learn to serve one another, and they're going to learn from one another. People are going to use their gifts to help people grow in this message, and we're going to live a corporate life that's reflective of this message. We're going to have a worldview where Jesus is raised, where Jesus is Lord, His grace is sufficient, and it's going to shape our beliefs, it's going to shape our values. And when the world sees our behaviors, they are going to believe that, yes, it's true. It's got to be true. These people are going to live this way. There has to be some merit to the message that, yes, this person really did come. He really was God, and He really did died for me, and He really did rise from the dead. This message needs to be preached. Ever notice that before the big game, before the big game, the coach, right? The coach, he doesn't just sit the players in seats or around tables and then bring in the analytics guy and talk about the batting average of everybody on the team or the specific statements. He doesn't speak, the coach does not speak to the mind and just give a bunch of information before the big game. That's not what brings them together. The coach brings everybody close so they can be a community. And he calls upon their hearts to believe in one another and what they're supposed to do, because it's a mental, emotional, social, relational, belonging community that calls them into the very mission that they are called to. Jesus doesn't give the church a mission, but Jesus' mission has a church. And as a church, we are the ones that encourage one another. That's why we got to get back in person. As we are in person, we make Jesus' grace more real. We make His love more real. We make His leadership more real in our lives. And yes, we preach it to one another and we practice it in our own lives. As a church, we need to practice one another these things that are true so that it can become more and more real to us. Athletes curate their lives around the calling to perform. An addict has to curate his or her life around their need to heal. Academics curate their time and attention around their calling to teach. Jesus' church, we curate our lives around the reality that Jesus is Lord and His grace is sufficient. And so for the rest of our lives, we're training, rehabbing, equipping, and doing everything we can to find our satisfaction fully in the truth of who God is and build our life on that foundation. I began the message reflecting upon how Paul was by himself in a hostile environment. I wanted you to think about what it was like to be by yourself. When I think of Paul by himself there in that hostile environment, I don't think in those days and age, a lot of people didn't have a lot of time by themselves. I wonder if he thought about that moment when he was called in the Damascus Road and it was just him and Jesus. I wonder if as he shared this message of accountability, if he reflected upon that moment at the end of his life where he's going to stand before Jesus. I want to give you a few moments now at the end of this message. Our time of prayer is an opportunity for you to just sit before God, you and Jesus, and ask Him, Lord, show me where I'm missing. Show me how real you are. Help me see where there might be cognitive dissonance between what I believe and how I behave. Let's just be quiet for a few moments. God, all of us in some way have a sense that you are the unknown God. There's aspects of who you are that we just can't know or fully understand or fully believe or fully make real in our lives. We are dependent upon you to show yourself to us. As you show yourself to us, I pray that you would give us belief that accepts who you are as true, accepts your way as true, that values who you are, and that shapes the way we behave as if you are the true leader, and that everything for our life and our joy and satisfaction can be found in you. May it play itself out in every aspect of our lives. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.